Great, thank you. Mr. Ashley?
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. Shortly in early December, I remember telling my wife that all I wanted for Christmas was a reauthorized federal law. We were finished with No Child Left Behind. So I got my wish for Christmas, but it did remind me of the time that many years ago, that I bought a bicycle for my oldest son, and when it was delivered the day before Christmas, it came in a box with those dreaded words that every parent hates to see, some assembly required. And so we find ourselves in a place here where we now have some assembly required. The good news is that the federal government has taken a step here in their reauthorization of No Child Left Behind for the Every Student Succeeds Act, which I'll refer to by its acronym, ESSA. So under ESSA, the states are given much greater latitude to design their own systems for accountability. So we've been living for a good 10, 12 plus years under two accountability systems, which really put the state in an awkward place because the federal system was based almost solely on sanctions and identifying schools with some shame. And so it put us as a state in an awkward position because we didn't want to develop then a second system that would do nothing but identify more schools for intervention or for that punishment of sanctions. So, so the good news is with the reauthorization that we now have ESSA, states get this opportunity to design a system, and we have an opportunity to design a system that will work for both state and federal purposes. In their reauthorization, they have identified a very different system of accountability, some very general parameters for states to follow in terms of the elements that have to go into a system. It's up to states to identify how schools will be identified for assistance and support, how the state gets the opportunity to define at what point a school or a district needs more intervention. The state gets to identify how those elements of accountability work together to identify these schools. It's no longer a federal top-down system, but a bottom-up, where the state gets to tell the federal government exactly what it is that we are going to do. And so we have a great opportunity. The good news for us is that California is in a great place to design this system. We were already underway, as you've heard from President Kirst and Sue Burr, that the state has already been undertaking this task for the last couple of years through the Local Control Accountability Plan and through our initial efforts to implement Senate Bill 1453, the Steinberg bill, which said the API should be more than just test scores. So we'd already begun the work of looking at things like college career indicators, how can graduation rates and test scores be combined, because we know that schools and districts are much more than just their test score. The API did some good things for us over the years, but the one thing that it did was it was very simple and it was easy. It reduced things to a number, but that was also its drawback, because it allowed people to misconceive or draw some misunderstandings about what that one number meant, and that somehow that one number represented their test scores, their school climate, their graduation rates, their attendance rates, their suspension rates, all of those things that go into making a school work well or not work well, or what needs to be improved. And that one number was simply incapable of providing that information, not only to policymakers or the state Department of Education or their state board, but to parents and to local communities. So moving away, which we were already in the process of doing, away from just test scores, we now have the great opportunity to put together a plan. ESSA calls 2016-17 a transition year. So we will continue with some processes already in place under No Child Left Behind as we write this transition plan and a state plan to be submitted to the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education has already allowed states to not not implement some of the services that they have under No Child Left Behind, the specific services of SES, the supplemental education services, choice transportation, these sort of things. The federal government has said that schools and districts need to continue to serve kids and to provide what they need. Maybe it's extended day opportunities or other things to help improve the school. But those specific activities are on hold during the 16-17 year while the state develops a plan. This plan, much of this plan will include the accountability system that we're talking about today. So during the 16-17 year, we're anticipating that a final approval of a state plan would become in January. So we have a little less than a year to put that together. We've taken the date of January, not because it's in law, but because the federal government has given themselves 120 days to approve such a plan and get back to the states for that approval. And we thought it was important that schools and districts understand what's in this plan and what's in this approved plan from the U.S. Department of Education before the 17-18 school year begins. But as you mentioned this morning, Madam Chair, in your opening remarks, the anticipation for this plan and for this accountability system is school year 2017-18. So along with this plan, we do hope, as was mentioned before by both LEO and our state board representatives, that we want this to be one single plan that works together to meet what we want to do here in California, and not something that, again, is top down from our federal government. So as we work through this process and as we finalize this accountability plan, one of the things that we would ask of you is your assistance in helping us clear away what we're referring to as the underbrush, some of the old education code that refers back to an API or the federal AYP systems. And as we move forward with an accountability system, at some point, your assistance is absolutely essential, because we need to reset the table, if you will, with our new accountability system. And so hopefully we can all work together to make that happen. As a last remark, it's already been mentioned, a lot of stakeholder input into the system. The superintendent also has a continuous improvement and accountability task force to look at the aspects of this new accountability system. This task force is working to coordinate with the efforts of the state board, and it's to not only coordinate but complement what's happening in the efforts in our public discussions of accountability at our state board education meetings, things like an integrated planning process. For years, we've had two plans. We've had a federal plan, which is referred to as the LEA plan for implementation, and of course now we have local control, and we have a local control accountability plan. We don't need two plans, and we don't need districts to be distracted by two plans. And so one of the efforts that we want to make is to make sure that we walk away with one accountability system and one planning process for schools and districts to use to get us there. In these task force meetings, also talking about the whole effort of continuous improvement, as Member Burr spoke on the left side of that chart. This is about all schools getting better, not just an identified 5%, which we know we need to do. This is really about all schools getting better and all districts getting better. And through our local control accountability plan, we think that we're well poised to do that. So with that, I think I'll stop and
Okay, do we have questions? Senator Blog and then Senator Pan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our witnesses today, Dr. Kirst and the others that we're going to hear from all day, are obviously eminent people in the fields, and I have nothing but the greatest respect for them. Having said that, in 1986, I first got elected to the County Board of Education in San Diego, and we were in a planning phase, and we were moving from one system to another. We were looking at some statewide standardized tests, and, patience was one of our words. I remember my first meeting with superintendent. He said, we need to be patient. It's now 30 years later. I know there have been many changes over the years. Hopefully we've seen improvement over the years. But in the last 3 years since I've been education budget chair in the Senate, we've added about $13 billion to K-12 education. My question is simply two questions. One, are the taxpayers getting their money's worth? And two, how do we know?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. How do we know? We have some indications through local boards and their own deliberations. So there's a setup at the local level to answer those questions, and I think that's the primary audience that one would deal with. In San Diego, they were going to have a distinctive context, and therefore I think how do we know is in part a local question. At the state level, as you see, we have multiple indicators, and I think it's very important to note that the federal government has bought into the idea of multiple measures. We're required to have multiple measures by the federal government to get federal aid. This was sort of a debate going on, I think, in the state, but now, I think it's more settled there. As one element of this system, we did give the Smarter Balanced Assessment. It provides lots of depth. It's very different. It's computer adaptive, so students are answering easy questions or get harder ones and so on. And it has extended response. You have to justify your answer, and it has a performance exam where you have to put things together and reach a conclusion. So we have some results. That's a baseline. And we'll be looking for growth in that, and I think we will have considerable growth. So I think at this point, the question is that we'll know a lot more soon, and right now the locals have to take what they have from their local setting, and we do have, of course, a set of assessments out there that are also guiding instruction through giving feedback to teachers on what students need to know.
I would just like to add that by the end of the week, we'll have one more item that will be posted that does a deep analysis of graduation rate. And the good news is we do have data on graduation rate. And for all students, the graduation rate has increased markedly over the last 5 years. For almost every subgroup, it has also increased. There's one or two subgroups that have kind of been static. There continue to be gaps among different subgroups. But for one of the indicators that we're looking at very carefully, we do have pretty hard data. Carrick is the data guy in the department, and I know there are other indicators that we have looked at over as part of this analysis that do show improvement. But you do have to kind of peel back the onion to get to that information.
So then I take that as, I heard a lot about how we might know. Do I take that as, yes, taxpayers are getting $13 billion worth over the last few years?
So I would say that that's not necessarily for me to answer in Sacramento. But what I can say is that, there have been a tremendous number of strides, especially in the last 5 years. As President Kearse was saying before, we now have a new funding source that we've completely changed how we fund schools. It's a major milestone. We now have longitudinal data system in which we can derive a very accurate cohort graduation rate, as Member Burr was saying, something we didn't have prior to 2010. So that's been in the last 5 years. As President Kearse mentioned, we've got an assessment system that now is much more accurate in defining students' progress and status of where they are and how they're performing. The prior test was good in its time, but it was old, and it was based on old standards. We now have new standards and a new assessment that more accurately identifies where students are. So we have a number of data at the Department of Education that gives us a statewide look at it, but just like the old AYP, NCLB type of accountability system, one answer doesn't fit all for your answer of, are we getting our money's worth? That's an answer that really is best given at the local level, where they have not only our state data available to them, but they have a lot of local data available to them that allows them to tell the local story of what's happening in their community. All we can tell you at the state level is data that's comparable and statewide and valid and reliable that applies to all schools and districts. But things like parent survey and parent participation in programs, all of that information that is locally driven that we don't have at the state, that fills out the story of what's happening in schools and districts. So that's really a question that needs to be answered by 1,000 school districts.
Okay, last follow-up then, and thank you for your answers. I don't really mean to put you on the spot. It's just, this is a question I get from constituents, you know, especially when times were bad, it was easier for us because, you know, we had no money and we're cutting schools. Now that we've added $13 billion to the schools, people are demanding results, and patience isn't a word they really want to hear in return. So let me ask you this. You say it's got to be locally driven, the answer to the question, are we getting our money's worth? We represent the state. When will we know, by 2017, by October of 2020, at what date will we know if locally, taking all that data, putting it together on a statewide basis, our taxpayers get their money's worth? Do we even know what that means? And if we do, when will we have an answer? Statewide, not locally, statewide. Give me a date.
Well, I think what we're looking for is growth. So you have to set a baseline, and we've done that with the assessment, and we'll have graduation rates. We'll have other things that we will that are in this 8 state priorities over here that we know how to measure. So I would say you would begin to look for next year, and so we will have a new assessment round this spring. We'll have a new graduation calculation this year. So you'll begin to see some indicators. And, you know, I think the local people ought to say, is it rising or not? And the state people as well. Is there growth? Are we just stagnant? And I think that is another area. Another thing that we're doing, and I think will play a bigger role, is we're taking all the state schools and districts and putting them on a chart, and then you have a total distribution. And in that distribution, you have what we would call a red zone. These are schools, for example, that have a graduation rate of 67%, and they haven't changed over 2 or 3 years. Those are probably, you're not, you know, we need to look at that. You're not, it may not, this money isn't moving those indicators. But so I think we'll begin to see the growth measures in this next year. So we really are just beginning with a baseline in that regard.
The other thing I would say is I agree with the timeline. I think by the time we get the next cohort of test scores, which will come late June-ish, by the time we get everything, we'll know where we are in a statewide assessment that will be comparable. But with respect to local measures, I want to go back to something that Edgar said, because we forget about the school accountability report cards, which have been in place since 1988. Every single school has to generate them, and there's got to be 20 different measures on those school accountability report cards. So at the local level, I would hope, I always try to turn to parents and say, be sure that you're checking those out, because it's going to say a lot of information. Are you offering college-level coursework? How many AP classes do you give? What are you paying your teachers? It's a very well-rounded document, but we sort of forget about it because it was something we did a long time ago. But it is out there. It's there now for people to use in terms of making an assessment of their individual schools.
Dr. Pan?
Thank you so much. I know, appreciate your presentation. One of the things that you made mention of in your testimony, I know some people have some concerns about, is that being able to, so one is that actually is, as far as LCFF is concerned, we're looking at essentially school districts, and then, but school districts come in different sizes, some are very large, and there's tremendous disparity between different schools, different neighborhoods. So what are we doing to be sure there's accountability? And, you know, we have a funding formula that gives more money for districts to have schools in more challenging areas. but how do we know, big school district that's where they're directing those extra resources to, and not to the other schools who have fewer issues. So what are we doing to look at individual schools from a state policy perspective and think how effective we are in doing that? And then I guess the other question is that you also made mention is that the reports back they take account of the entire school budget, right? You made mention, so the school budget maybe is more than necessarily just what's through LCFF, but we all know about cost shifting and so forth. Again, is the money that we're allocating actually going to the places we're targeting? It's because certainly we want to give more direction, more priority setting to the local school districts, but in many ways we still have to at least see what the actual effect is. So it's great to set goals in the beginning. Obviously, evaluation, I'm a big believer in evaluation is very important. Then there's also what actually happened? And that I think we don't seem to talk as much about, is that, we said we're trying to do this, we're having an evaluation, and then what actually happened, and then what should be the consequence of that. So I know you're the evaluators, and you're still working on that, but can you elaborate a little more, because you made mention of it, but elaborate a little more about what we're doing to look at how schools really are distributing their resources. And the fact is that they should already have that information, because they should be providing that to their local constituents. So that should not be additional information they have to gather. That should be information that we also get as well to look at our to look at the effectiveness of our activities.
There's two parts to that Member Burr will address, the flow of money to the schools, and then how are the schools doing after they get it.
Right.
So
although the focus of the review is at the district level, the local controlled funding formula requires that the plans include what's happening at the individual schools. So when they adopt their local control accountability plan, they have to talk about what they're doing at the schools. They have to do that through each LEA has to do that through a regular budget process, open meeting, broad-based consultation, et cetera. But they also, once they do that, they have to submit it to their county superintendents. And the county superintendents review those plans to say, are you doing what you're supposed to do with respect to allocating the resources? There are also spending regulations I mentioned at the very beginning that we adopted back in 2013 initially to ensure that the money that's intended for the English learner students, low-income students, foster students, is spent proportionally in that way. So that's checked at the front end. There's also a requirement that there be an annual audit in the audits, so that's kind of the back end. The independent auditors have to report, did they spend their money the way they said they were going to? If not, they get an audit exception that has to be cleared at the county level again. So while the county superintendents are sort of our agents initially to say, is this going the way it's supposed to or not? And then the LEAs have to do their own annual update, which is also reviewed to say, you set this goal, you said you were going to increase graduation rate by fill in a number. Did you actually do it? And that again goes back, that's what this chart is intended to show.
What I'm hearing is school district, county superintendent reviews, has to approve. What I'm not hearing is the state collects the data and looks at how we're doing. Is that part of that too?
We don't, at this point, the county superintendents are our agents in this respect.
Right, but the data itself,
fiscal planning.
Right, so, yeah, and I understand we can have the county superintendents review and sign off, but the data, are we gathering that data to look at how we're doing as a state? How was the money being, obviously, it's, school districts is important for people who live in the school district, and people who actually care a lot more probably about their own school than just even the school district, and then they have counties. But also in terms of from a policy perspective and evaluation, we want to know how are we using our overall education dollars. I mean, there's a big chunk of state, but there's also others. I mean, how is that? So it's great the county superintendents. I'm not even saying the state signs off on it, but are we gathering that information and that data so we know how we're directing, from a state policy perspective, how we're directing our resources? Is it turning out that our state resources are going one place, but all the other resources are going somewhere else? So what I'm hearing is that it's great, county superintendents should be reviewing, but that data is out there. Shouldn't we be gathering that and looking at so we can understand the impact of our our policies and our financial decisions?
Well, I think we will be gathering it and making an evaluation of how are we doing.
So will be is like which date? Will we be gathering it then?
Well, we're probably back to the same date that we gave to Senator Block, because we still have baseline data.
2017?
Right. Because we have to look at the indicators and make a decision, I think, to your point, Senator Pan, is it a sound investment? Are we seeing an increase in graduation rate? Are we seeing an increase in
We're
these
talking about the entire school budget, not just, right? Okay.
Yeah, but your question, as I understand, part of it is where's the money going, not just whether the graduation rate is increasing. And Member Burr was a business manager of a very large school district, Elk Grove, and my understanding in looking at this is that our current accounting system doesn't really allow much of analysis. It's in big blocks, instruction and things of that sort. You can't unpack it. Now, what we did with the categoricals, in which we got rid of, was we had an earmarked set of funds to add counselors, and then we had people in the State Department that checked that. And we had a compliance for 41 categorical silos going down there. So they built into the accounting code little add-ons for each categorical program. When we went to the local control funding formula, those add-ons for each categorical got stricken. So we're back to what all budgets have looked like for years in school districts, which are under very broad categories that are really nationally normed and nationally used nationally. And so we have conformed to that. Maybe you could add to this, but this is the back-end auditing of, and the, it's not just auditing, but the accounting system is not fine-grained and has not been in American public school history to really answer at the state level how much money is going to counselors. A lot of people added counselors. How much money is going to new English teachers or something.
So I would argue then that's a problem. And that's a problem actually not only at the state level for all of us here, that's a problem at the local level, because if they're not, that information isn't available for the parents in the school district, how do they know, how are they going to advocate within even their own school district for appropriate priorities for the LCEFF funding that we're distributing to them if that information isn't available? I mean, we probably had a place where we had categoricals that forced people to give category, and that's not what we're trying to go back. But there should be enough information in the financials that will allow not only us, but also the parents and the constituents of the school district to actually know how they're distributing their resources. Because in many ways, what I'm saying is let's just collect the information that people already have. But if they don't even have that information, how are they able to advocate within their school district and know what's going on even in their own school district if the school district isn't maintaining that kind of information? And I don't know how what county the superintendent's looking at then. What are they looking at then if they're maybe just overall, but is the school district about to go bankrupt or not? I mean, we had some challenges during recession with that, but how are they reviewing if everything's in such big blocks that you can't see what's going on inside? So to me, this speaks to a bigger problem then.